On October 14th, 2025, at some point during that ordinary Tuesday, a security update went out to Windows 10 machines around the world, and it was the last one that would ever arrive for free. No fanfare, no countdown clock on your taskbar, just a quiet, permanent door closing behind 1,300 million people who had built their entire digital lives on that operating system. If you were not paying attention that week, you would have had no idea anything had changed. Your computer still turned on. Your files were still there. Your browser still opened. But from that Tuesday forward, every single security flaw discovered in Windows 10, every exploit, every vulnerability that hackers find and sell and weaponize would simply never be patched again unless you paid for it. And here's the part that should genuinely alarm you. Canalys estimated that roughly 240 million personal computers on the planet physically cannot run Windows 11 at all. Not won't. Cannot. The chip inside them, the processor generation, the missing security module soldered to the motherboard, all of it disqualifies them by Microsoft's own hardware rulebook. 240 million working machines, capable of everything a normal person does every day, suddenly told they no longer belong. That is not a rumor. That is not internet paranoia. That is the exact moment a migration that had been quietly building for years turned into something that looks, from the outside, like a stampede. And I want to walk you through exactly what is happening, why it is happening right now in the second half of 2026, and why the operating system a huge number of these people are turning to is not a mystery Linux distribution built by hobbyists in a basement, but something that has quietly become good enough to replace Windows for millions of ordinary users who never once considered themselves tech people. Because the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this is that most of those 240 million people have no idea their machine is now living on borrowed time. They did not read a Microsoft support bulletin. They did not sit through a life cycle presentation. Their laptop still boots, their email still loads, their kids still finish their homework on it, and by every visible signal, nothing is wrong. That is exactly what makes an end of support date so dangerous. It is invisible until the moment it isn't, until a piece of malware exploiting an unpatched flaw finally finds its way onto a machine that Microsoft quietly stopped defending months earlier. Let's start with the number that should stop you cold. According to StatCounter's tracking data, which measures usage across more than 3 billion monthly page views, Linux desktop share sat at 2.76% back in July of 2022. That is basically background noise, the kind of number enthusiasts argued about on forums while everyone else ignored it completely. By 2025, that figure had climbed to roughly 4.7%, already a 70% jump in under 3 years. Then 2026 happened. Through the spring, StatCounter had Linux hovering in the 3 to 4% range globally, with the United States separately crossing 5% for the very first time in June of 2025, a milestone that had literally never been reached in 3 decades of Linux existing as a desktop option. Then in June 2026, Linux climbed to 4.39% worldwide, and Windows itself slipped under 60% of global desktop traffic for the first time in years. And then July 2026 delivered a number that made tech journalists sit up and start double-checking their sources. StatCounter's July data showed Linux crossing 7.5% globally, with North America alone reportedly touching somewhere between 10 and 12%. Now, I want to be honest with you here, because a good analysis does not just repeat exciting numbers, it checks them. PC World dug into that July spike and found real reason for caution. Because StatCounter measures page views rather than actual unique human users, the report noted that bot traffic and automated scraping tools, many of which run on Linux servers and get miscounted as desktop users, likely inflated that particular jump. Cloudflare's separate traffic data, filtered specifically for genuine human visitors, showed a far smaller and steadier increase. So the honest picture is this: the dramatic double-digit headline is probably exaggerated by measurement noise. But underneath that noise sits a real sustained multi-year climb that even the most conservative reading puts north of 4% globally, and closer to 6 or 7% in the United States specifically, which is still one of the fastest documented growth periods for desktop Linux since the operating system was created 35 years ago. That is not a rounding error. That is a structural shift happening in plain sight. So what is actually driving it? Because it would be lazy to just say Linux got better and leave it there. The truth is that Microsoft built the on-ramp for this migration almost entirely by itself. That October 14th, 2025 deadline is the headline event, but it is not the whole story. Microsoft did throw those 240 million stranded users a small lifeline, a program called Extended Security Updates, which for consumers costs around $30 and buys exactly 1 additional year of critical security patches running through October 13th, 2026. That is it. 1 year. Not renewable for home users, Businesses get a longer runway if they are willing to keep paying, with the price doubling to roughly $61 in year 2 and doubling again after that. And anyone who waits to enroll has to pay retroactively for every year they skipped, because the program treats those updates as cumulative rather than optional add-ons. But for a regular household, none of that tiered pricing matters, because the consumer bridge is capped at a single year. When that date arrives this coming October, the bridge simply ends permanently, with no second extension being offered to ordinary consumers. And there is a second, quieter deadline stacked right on top of that one that almost nobody outside IT circles has heard about. Starting in June of 2026, the original security certificates Microsoft issued back in 2011 to verify that a Windows machine boots up safely and hasn't been tampered with began expiring. Devices that have not received updated certificates face a real risk of boot failures down the line. So you have two clocks ticking at once, one financial and one technical, both pointing at the same conclusion for anyone still holding an older machine. A coalition called the End of 10 Initiative, backed by major distributions including Debian, Fedora, and Zorin OS, launched specifically to catch people falling through this gap with one simple pitch. Do not throw away a computer that still works perfectly, just because a corporation decided it no longer qualifies. But the hardware deadline alone does not explain everything, because plenty of people whose machines run Windows 11 just fine are leaving too. And that is where Windows 11 itself starts working against Microsoft. The mandatory Microsoft account requirement baked into a fresh Windows 11 install is not a small annoyance. Try setting up a new PC without an internet connection and you will hit a wall almost immediately. You are required to log in with an online account just to use hardware you already paid for outright. That single design choice tells you something about who the operating system is actually built to serve. Then there is Recall, the feature Microsoft announced back in 2024 that continuously takes screenshots of everything happening on your screen to build a searchable local database of your activity. Security researchers reacted immediately and loudly, pointing out that a feature quietly logging your keystrokes, banking sessions, and private messages is functionally indistinguishable from a keylogger, just one built directly into the operating system by the manufacturer instead of installed by an attacker. The backlash forced Microsoft to make it opt-in and delay it multiple times. But the damage to trust had already happened. Once a mainstream user asks the question, wait, what else is this thing quietly recording about me? The question does not go back to sleep. It spreads. People who had never once opened a privacy settings menu in their life suddenly started digging through Windows telemetry options, disabling ad identifiers, turning off diagnostic data collection they didn't know existed. And for a growing number of them, the natural next step was to wonder why they were fighting their own operating system just to keep it out of their business in the first place. And it pushes people toward a system that, because no single company owns it or profits from harvesting your data, structurally cannot ask that question of you in the first place. Now here is where I want to slow down, because the image most people carry around in their heads of what Linux actually looks like in 2026 is roughly a decade out of date. If your mental picture involves a black terminal window, cryptic typed commands, and an entire weekend lost, hunting for a Wi-Fi driver on some forgotten forum, I understand exactly where that comes from, because that used to be a genuinely accurate description. It simply is not anymore. Take Zorin OS 18.1, released on April 15th of this year. The moment you install it, before you even open a single settings menu, the desktop can be switched with one click to visually mirror Windows 10, Windows 11, or Mac OS, depending on whichever layout your muscle memory already knows. That detail matters enormously, because the cognitive overload of learning a completely unfamiliar interface while also adjusting to a new ecosystem is exactly what sends most first-time switchers running back to Windows within a week. Linux Mint 22, which will run comfortably on any 64-bit machine with as little as 2 gigabytes of RAM and 20 gigabytes of storage, ships with a software manager that behaves exactly like the App Store already sitting on your phone. You search, you click install, it configures itself. No hunting for an executable file on some sketchy website, no confusing installer wizard, none of the friction that used to define the experience. And the hardware compatibility story has genuinely transformed. Kernel 6.15 folded into the current development cycle earlier this year, absorbed contributions from more than 2,000 individual developers. That sustained level of engineering means the overwhelming majority of laptops, desktops, and peripherals simply work the moment you boot up. No driver hunting required. This matters specifically for the Windows 10 refugee wave because, by definition, the machines that fail Microsoft's hardware checklist are older machines. And older hardware is exactly where Linux driver support is most mature and most battle-tested. A laptop from 2017 or 2018 that gets rejected by the TPM 2.0 requirement is not a risky Linux install. It is close to an ideal one. The trackpad already has years of refined driver support behind it. The Wi-Fi chipset has been tested by thousands of other users running the exact same kernel. The graphics stack, the audio controller, the battery management, all of it has been iterated on for years rather than being brand new and unproven. You plug in, you boot the installer, and the overwhelming majority of the time, everything simply functions on the very first try, which is precisely the opposite of what most people still assume going in. The software gap has narrowed dramatically too. LibreOffice handles the vast majority of Word, Excel, and PowerPoint files without meaningful friction for most everyday use. But the bigger shift is how much professional work now happens entirely inside a browser tab, through Google Docs, Microsoft 365 Online, Notion, and dozens of similar platforms that render identically whether you're on Windows, macOS, or Linux. For a huge share of knowledge workers, the operating system underneath the browser has become almost irrelevant to their actual daily workflow, which means one of the classic objections to switching has quietly dissolved without most people even noticing. For creative professionals, DaVinci Resolve maintains a genuinely full-featured native Linux version, actively developed by Blackmagic Design, not a stripped-down afterthought, but the same professional tool used in real Hollywood post-production pipelines. And developers have already voted with their feet. The Stack Overflow Developer Survey found that 27.8% of respondents use Ubuntu specifically for personal computing, with a nearly identical figure for professional work, which tells you this is not a fringe curiosity confined to hobbyists. It is mainstream behavior inside one of the most technically literate workforces on the planet. Now, let's talk about the single development that changed everything, because it wasn't the desktop environments getting more polished, and it wasn't the driver situation improving. It was a handheld gaming device Valve shipped in February of 2022. The Steam Deck runs on Linux, and because Valve needed its enormous existing game library to work reliably on that device, the company was forced to solve a problem that had blocked serious Linux desktop adoption for a generation, making Windows games run on Linux at scale, automatically, without asking the user to configure anything. The tool they built to do that is called Proton, and the compatibility layer beneath it, Wine, has been evolving at a remarkable pace ever since. When the Steam Deck first shipped, Proton support was genuinely uneven, a mix of titles that ran beautifully next to others that crashed on launch or refused to save progress correctly, and early adopters spent real time tweaking configuration flags just to get certain games stable. That friction is largely gone now. Valve poured sustained engineering resources into the project for 4 straight years, specifically because their entire handheld business depended on it working. And that kind of corporate incentive, a company with billions of dollars riding on Linux gaming actually functioning, is something the Linux desktop had simply never had access to before. Valve released Proton 11.0, built on Wine 11.0, on July 7th of this year, and the numbers now are genuinely hard to overstate. Tracking sites like ProtonDB put overall compatibility for Windows games on Steam somewhere close to 90%, meaning you click play and it simply launches. No workaround, no terminal commands, no fiddling with configuration files. More than 30,000 titles carry at least a supported compatibility rating, and close to 10,000 of those are fully verified for flawless play on Steam Deck hardware specifically. A bar that measures not just whether a game boots, but whether it runs well with correct controller mapping, proper text sizing, and stable performance throughout. On Valve's own hardware survey, Linux hit a record 5.33% of all surveyed Steam users in March of 2026, the highest figure ever recorded in that survey's history. It has pulled back somewhat since then, down into the mid 3 to 4% range by June, partly because of shifts in how Valve samples its user base, and partly because Steam Deck units were reportedly out of stock in some regions right before that survey window. But look past the single-month noise and the 2-year trend line is unmistakable. And here is the detail that tells you this is not just a Steam Deck story. 2 years ago, Steam Deck owners made up roughly 42% of all Linux gamers tracked on Steam. By early 2026, that share had dropped to around 24%, which means organic desktop Linux gaming, people installing a distribution on their own regular computer and choosing to game there voluntarily, has been growing even faster than the handheld device itself. The Steam Deck opened the door, but people are walking through it and staying on their desktops. I do want to be precise about where the real limits still sit, because an honest analysis does not pretend the gaps have vanished. That roughly 90% compatibility figure covers the broad Steam catalog. And for single-player games, open-world titles, strategy games, simulation games, and the enormous world of indie releases, the experience is excellent to near flawless, and in some optimized titles, frame rates on Linux actually edge out an equivalent Windows installation thanks to lower system overhead. The real, unresolved sticking point is kernel-level anti-cheat software in competitive multiplayer games. Valorant, Fortnite, and Destiny 2 simply do not run on Linux, and this is not a bug. Proton will eventually patch around, it is a deliberate architectural choice by those developers. Systems like Riot's Vanguard anti-cheat require privileged kernel-level access specifically inside Windows, built by design to detect tampering below the level of the game itself, and that kind of access does not pass through a compatibility layer. Two other major anti-cheat frameworks, BattleEye and Easy Anti-Cheat, have both built optional Linux support directly into their systems, meaning developers could turn it on with relatively little extra work, and some are beginning to as the Linux player base grows large enough to justify the effort. But if your gaming identity is built entirely around those three specific kernel-locked titles, Linux is honestly not your platform yet in August of 2026. Even so, the wider ecosystem is adapting around that gap. Xbox Cloud Gaming runs directly through a browser on Linux, which means titles like Fortnite are technically reachable through cloud streaming in a setup that takes a few minutes to configure, not native execution, not ideal, but a real functional bridge. GOG Galaxy, the storefront client that has historically been Windows and Mac OS only, has an official Linux version actively in development, which matters because GOG's catalog leans heavily toward classic and DRM-free titles, exactly the category where Proton compatibility is already strongest. The pressure is not staying confined to individual households either. Governments have started doing the same cost-benefit math at scale. Germany announced plans in 2025 to migrate roughly 30,000 government computers away from Microsoft toward Linux and LibreOffice. Denmark and Switzerland launched comparable public sector initiatives around the same period. These are not ideological gestures from officials trying to make a statement. These are procurement decisions made by people responsible for enormous IT budgets, who look squarely at Windows licensing costs, the hardware replacement cycle, Windows 11's requirements force onto aging equipment fleets, and the data sovereignty implications of running a foreign corporation's telemetry collecting software on sensitive government systems, and concluded the math simply no longer favored staying put. When institutions with that much at stake start making the same calculation ordinary users are making at home, it tells you the direction of travel is not a temporary blip. These are organizations with legal teams, procurement audits, and multi-year budget cycles, none of which move quickly or casually. A government agency does not switch its desktop fleet on a whim or because a headline looked appealing. It switches because someone ran the numbers on licensing renewals, hardware refresh costs, and long-term support risk, and the spreadsheet pointed away from Microsoft. That is a far more durable signal than any single viral post about market share. So let's get to the part that actually matters to you personally, sitting wherever you're sitting right now, deciding whether any of this applies to your situation. I'm not going to give you the enthusiast pitch that pretends there is zero friction, because that would be dishonest, and you would find out within a week anyway. Here is the honest, practical approach. Do not reformat anything. Do not make an irreversible decision based on a video. Go download an ISO file from the Linux Mint or Zorin OS website. Use a free tool like Rufus or Etcher to put it on a spare USB drive, and boot your existing computer straight from that USB stick. What you get is a full live version of Linux, complete with a working browser and file manager, running entirely without touching a single file on your existing Windows installation. Spend 2 real hours doing the things you actually do every day. Open your usual streaming service, check your email, open a document you actually care about, see whether your Wi-Fi connected automatically, and check whether your display resolution rendered correctly right out of the gate. That 2-hour test will tell you more honest information than any comparison article, including this one, ever could, because it is happening on your exact hardware, with your exact peripherals, running your exact everyday workflow, not a reviewer's curated setup on a machine you will never own. If that test feels comfortable, and for most modern machines it genuinely will, the next reasonable step is a dual boot setup rather than a full wipe. Keep your Windows partition completely intact, give Linux its own separate partition, and spend 30 days actually living inside it as your primary environment, while retaining the ability to reboot into Windows for anything that genuinely still requires it. Most people who run that 30-day experiment land on one of 2 honest outcomes. Either they discover they are booting back into Windows far less often than they expected, which tells them the switch is genuinely practical for their life, or they identify the specific handful of applications or games that are truly non-negotiable, which gives them an honest, clear-eyed picture of what switching would actually cost them. Neither outcome wastes a single hour of your time, because both leave you with an honest answer instead of a guess. For anyone sitting inside that group of 240 million people whose hardware physically cannot run Windows 11, and whose consumer security updates run out this coming October, this decision carries real weight beyond simple preference. It becomes a choice between continuing to run an increasingly unpatched, increasingly exposed machine connected to the same internet as everyone else, or making a transition that takes some real effort but hands you a fully supported, actively maintained, genuinely free operating system on the exact same hardware you already own. The End of 10 campaign and its backing distributions built their documentation specifically for people who have never touched a terminal in their life and installing Linux Mint 22 on a machine that fails. The Windows 11 checklist takes roughly the same amount of time and the same level of technical confidence as reinstalling Windows 10 itself. If you were able to set up Windows 10 on your own at some point, you are absolutely capable of installing Linux Mint. Here is my honest read of where things stand in August of 2026. Linux is genuinely ready for most ordinary people right now. Not someday, not once it matures a little further, but right now. The desktop experience has been polished into something a first-time user can sit down at without a manual. Hardware compatibility on anything more than a year or two old is excellent. The gaming picture is strong for the overwhelming majority of how people actually play, with a small, clearly defined, honestly acknowledged gap around a handful of kernel anti-cheat titles. The software ecosystem covers what a typical person actually does with a computer day to day. The privacy and ownership argument has arguably never been stronger, precisely because Windows 11 keeps handing people fresh reasons to ask uncomfortable questions about who their computer actually serves. And the external pressure, the hardware deadline, the licensing costs, the expanding telemetry, has never been higher. At the exact same moment, the alternative has never been more polished. Those two curves meeting at the same point in time is not a coincidence, and historically that is exactly the combination of conditions that produces a real, lasting shift in how an entire population uses its computers, rather than another passing enthusiast trend that fades once the headlines move on. You do not need to make a dramatic decision today. Download the ISO, build the USB drive, spend 2 honest hours with it. That is genuinely the only commitment being asked of you right now. If those 2 hours feel comfortable, which for the vast majority of people they will, the 30-day parallel test will tell you everything else you actually need to know about whether this is right for your life. The barrier to finding out has never been lower, and the reasons to stay locked inside a system that increasingly treats you as something to be monetized rather than someone to be served have rarely looked weaker than they do right now in the second half of 2026, with that October deadline sitting right on the calendar in front of millions of people who have not yet made up their minds. Whichever way you decide to go, decide with your eyes open on your own hardware, using your own 2 hours, instead of taking either side's word for it.